We have 2 more presentations this afternoon before our poster session, which begins at 5:30. And as I said earlier, there's beer and wine, so don't forget that, and excellent posters. Right now we have a presentation from my good friend, Darren Parry, and I'm really excited for you to listen to what he has to say. Darren's going to mix it up, and we're lucky to have him here.
Maybe I better start out by saying that I'm not here. I serve as the former chairman of the tribe, but I'm not here to speak on behalf of the tribe. I'm here to muse as an old, tired Indian today. And the tone's going to be different, so prepare yourself. For 6 years, we've held press conferences, passed policies, spent hundreds of millions of dollars with a promise to save the Great Salt Lake. In 2020, the lake sat roughly at 4192. And I would say by the end of the summer, at the most conservative estimate, we'll be at 4190. 2 feet. After all the task forces, after all the innovation, after all the money spent, after all the promises to fill the lake by 2034. From an indigenous perspective, this tells us something deeper. The problem has never been a lack of science. It has never been a lack of intelligence or technology or even money. Our people understood water long before there were agencies to manage it. We understood that water is not a commodity that could be bought or sold or owned. It was a relative. It was alive. It required reciprocity. What we are witnessing today is not a failure of engineering. It's a reflection of our values. You cannot divert more water every year, continue unchecked development, consume beyond balance, and expect the lake to rise because a policy was signed. You cannot treat water like profit and expect it to behave like prayer. We are less than 50% of normal snowpack. The climate is shifting. The demands are increasing. Yet we still speak as if intention alone will refill the basin. In our teachings, when something sacred begins to disappear, it's not the earth that is failing. It's our relationship with it. 6 years, hundreds of millions of dollars, 2 feet lower. At some point, we need to ask ourselves, are we trying to save the lake, or are we trying to preserve a lifestyle? Because solving this will not come from better modeling or bigger budgets. It will come when we decide that the lake deserves more water than we do. This has never been a science problem. It's always been a values problem. And until our values change, the shoreline will continue to move. All of this brings us to a moment of reckoning, not just about the lake, but the story we've been telling ourselves about land and water and our place within both. What we are witnessing today didn't happen overnight. It is a result of generations of decisions, of assumptions, of values that have guided how we take and how we use and how we justify water. And now the consequences of those choices are no longer distant or theoretical. They're visible, they're measurable, and they are here. The shoreline is receding, the dust is rising, and the system is under strain. And so we find ourselves at a point where we can no longer avoid a deeper question. Whose water? Whose responsibility? From an indigenous perspective, the first question is not who owns the water. The first question is, how are we related to it? Because how we answer that question will determine everything that follows. If we answer that question honestly, we must be willing to look back. Because the way we understand water today did not begin with us. It was shaped decision by decision long before any of us were ever here. It was shaped by the choices people made when they first arrived in this valley and by what they prioritized and by what they believed was necessary for their survival and by how they understood their relationship to water. Those early moments matter because it set the pattern of use, pattern of control, pattern of thinking that has carried forward for generations. If you look back to the earliest days of settlement in this valley, we begin to see something important. Members of the Vanguard Company, Brigham Young's advancement group, recorded in a journal that within 2 hours of arrival in the Salt Lake Valley, they began to plow and dig ditches. That same afternoon, they built a dam to irrigate the soil. By the next day, they had turned water onto the crops. Another journal entry noted that a small dam and ditch on City Creek irrigated about 5 acres that first day. Think about that. The very first act of settlement was not shelter, it wasn't community building, it was water control. Before the first permanent homes were built, before the city was even laid out, the water was already being redirected. That moment represents more than survival. It represents a shift from relationship to extraction, from reciprocity to control. Just a few years later, in 1869, as he explored this region, John Wesley Powell warned, "You are piling up a heritage of conflict and litigation over water rights, for there is not sufficient water to supply the land." That warning was not just about scarcity. It was about a new worldview. And that worldview has consequences. So let me ask you a harder question. In a society based on exploitation within a finite world, what happens when there's nothing left to exploit? No land, no resource, no water, no people. We have built a fragile economy that depends upon unsustainable consumption to survive. What happens when it can no longer sustain itself? Would it not have been better to manage these resources for the benefit of the whole community and for future generations? Because when you look back, The short-term gains were insignificant compared to the long-term cost. We have seen this pattern before. Mines and extractive projects often cost more public money to clean up than they ever produced, while making a very few people very wealthy. Species have disappeared. The poor are pushed deeper into poverty. The middle class sees wages shrink and benefits decline. So we have to ask, can a society sustain a mindset of what's mine is mine and what's yours belongs to me? And here we are in the West. This has become real when we talk about water rights. Water is the most limiting factor for growth and the most critical factor for survival. When you begin to see all of this together, the history, the patterns, the consequences, it shifts how you understand this place. You begin to realize that the land has always been telling us something. The limits were never hidden. The reality of this basin and its boundaries, its possibilities, was always written in the water itself. But instead of listening to those natural boundaries, we drew our own line. We drew lines on a map, jurisdictions, claims, divisions that made sense on paper, but not on land. And over time, we organized ourselves around those lines, politically, economically, legally, even when the water did not follow. And so we find ourselves trying to manage something that refuses to be contained by a system that we created. Think about this. It keeps me up at night. We are trying to solve a problem using the very framework that created the problem. There were those early on who recognized this tension, who understood that in a place like the West, water is not just one issue among many. It is the issue that defines all others. That is why John Wesley Powell suggested something remarkably simple. Political boundaries in the West should be based on watersheds, because water, not lines on a map, should determine what is possible. And if we allow ourselves to grapple with that idea, to follow it without rushing to where it leads, we begin to feel it pressing on something deeper, not just how we organize our systems, but how we understand our place in the world. Because when we recognize that water determines what's possible, that it moves according to its own laws, that it gives life, carries memory, and connects everything that it touches, it begins to soften our certainty about ownership. It invites a different question, one less about control and more about relationship. And in that space, we're left to consider, what does it really mean to say that one person or group can own it? Should someone be able to own water? If we can own land, can we own water? Can we own air? Can we own sunlight? And then when we move from philosophy to legal reality, the question becomes unavoidable. Is there a point where a legal claim to water loses its legitimacy when that right puts the entire community at risk? Because let's be honest about what this system is. Much of the infrastructure that captures and stores water and delivers water, dams, canals, diversions, was not built by the individuals that hold the water right. It was built with public money, our taxpayer money. And without that investment, many of those water rights we defend today would never exist, because they would have been economically not viable. So we must ask, what exactly is being protected, and who is really paying the cost? Today, we say we are investing to save the Great Salt Lake. But look closer at where the money is going. It's going into systems that could return water to the lake. History has shown us, though, how this plays out. Efficiency does not guarantee restoration. More often, it's the opposite. Jevons paradox tells us that when we become more efficient with a valuable resource in a growth-based economy, we often use more of that resource and not less. Efficiency frees up water for it to be used elsewhere. And so the lake continues to decline, not because we lack the solutions, but because the system is doing exactly what the system is designed to do: deliver water that we can use, and not necessarily to return it to where it needs to go. This paradox points us back to something deeper. Our relationship with the earth will always mirror our relationship with each other. My grandmother used to say that restoring balance is not just about rivers or sagebrush plains. It's about balance within your own heart and within your own community. She would always say, if your heart is noisy, you cannot hear the earth. In the Shoshone language, there's no word for wilderness. The idea that land and water are separate from people is foreign to us. We are part of one great living system, braided together with soil and water and wind and all living things. So when the lake declines, it tells us something is out of balance. The world is asking something from us right now. It's asking for a return to the fire, not the fire of destruction, but the fire once carried in the human spirit, the fire of responsibility, the fire of relationships, the fire of deep and steady love. Not the passive love of feeling, but the active love that shapes how one walks in this world. And that kind of love demands change. Because real hope is not believing that things will get better on their own. Real hope is having the courage to change so they can. So where do we go to from here? Maybe it begins by asking better questions. Not, how do we get more water? But, how do we restore our relationship to it? Not, how do we sustain growth? But, what are we willing to limit to sustain life? Not, who owns the water? But what does the water require from us? And maybe it also means rethinking who we listen to. For generations, indigenous elders have carried knowledge of land, water, and memory, and balance. In a world searching for directions, perhaps the answer has been here all along. Maybe it's time we make space. Maybe it's time we listen. Let me leave you with this, and then maybe I'll dare take a question. The Great Salt Lake is not just a body of water. It's a relative. It's a teacher. It's a mirror. And right now, it is telling us something. The question is not whether we have the knowledge, because we do. The question is whether we have the courage to let that knowledge change us. Because this is not simply about a lake receding. It's about a relationship that's unraveling. And every relationship we have asks something of us: attention, humility, and responsibility. So the question before us now is simple but heavy. Will we continue as we are? Or will we be humble enough ourselves to become a people who know how to listen again before the silence is all that remains? Thank you. Maybe one question, if it's not hard. This was scary. Uh-oh. Brave
Is this
soul.
working? Okay. So I think that's something that I've kind of thought about throughout this whole experience, right? Is we're talking about, like, selling water, like, who owns it and things like that. But I think that's something that we're often missing is, like, this intrinsic value of the habitat around us in the first place, right? I think that's something that we've lost through, like, settlement and things like that. Like, indigenous groups have always had that intrinsic knowledge and appreciation for what's around them. And how do you think that we can foster a community that sees that intrinsic value for more than, like, what this is really all about, right? Of us talking about selling it off, or of course we have to worry about people, but how do we also worry about the land on its own?
Oh, that's a really big question. And I would start by inviting indigenous people to be on your boards or committees, or just giving us a seat at the table. I often talk about the Colorado River and how it was set 100 years ago. 7 delegates from 7 states met behind closed doors to hammer out the Colorado River. They gave away twice as much water that was actually there. You know who wasn't there? 30 federally recognized tribes that called the Colorado River Basin home. But here's the question. What if they had been there? What if we had included indigenous elders with this wisdom 100 years ago as we crafted water policy? Would we be in the predicament that we're in today? I'll leave you with that thought. I don't think so. So we got to start somewhere. So maybe throw a Indian or 2 on your boards. So thank you, you guys.
All right, we made it. Final countdown before your beer and wine. Yes? And soft drinks. What? That? All right. We're just waiting for Deborah for 1 second. That would be awesome. Sure. Yeah, that would be great. Hello, welcome. Bringing it back for questions. We'll get another microphone here. Do you want to stand? I want to hold it. Wonderful. Thank you. I appreciate you all being here. The title of this panel is Agriculture, Conservation, and Water for the Lake. And I am happy to have these 4 panelists with me. And I'm going to turn the time over to them initially to introduce themselves. And then we'll get into some questions and hopefully have a good conversation. So Nathan, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Hannah. There we go. Thank you, Hannah. My name is Nathan Bracken. I'm a water attorney here in Salt Lake City. Represent, the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, which Adam works for, as well as a number of other water interests across the state. But I also represent farmers and irrigation companies, too. So I have a perspective of working to put water in the lake, which Adam and I do every day, and then working with farmers who have a different perspective and a similar perspective as well.
Hi, everyone. I'm Adam Wickline. I work with the Great Salt Lake Watershed Enhancement Trust, and now is my obligated time to tell you what the trust is because it's kind of complex. The trust is a program co-managed by the National Audubon Society and the Nature Conservancy in key partnership with state agencies like the Commissioner's Office, like the Division of Wildlife, and Forestry and Fire State Lands. Formed in 2023, from a $40 million fund set aside by the state legislature. Our job is to enact voluntary water transactions to get water to the lake, as well as protect and enhance wetlands around the lake that support the hydrology of the lake. I came on in 2023 as one of the first employees of the trust, but before that, I worked for a land trust in the Wasatch Back, Summit Land Conservancy, and in that role I got to go out and talk about land conservation using another voluntary incentive-based program using conservation easements to enact conservation objectives. And in that role, I got time to roll around ranches and farms in a side-by-side with producers, and got to understand Utah farmers and ranchers and get an in-depth view of what their interests and needs are and challenges they face in today's modern age. And I hope to bring that to my current role in doing water transactions with agricultural interests. So happy to talk about this today.
My name is Trevor Nielson. I'm the general manager of the Bear River Canal Company. The Bear River Canal Company is located just off the northeast arm of the Great Salt Lake. It's the largest irrigation company in the state of Utah. Oh, yeah. Maybe I'll try and see if this one's a little louder. Is that better? Okay. We irrigate 68,000 acres of highly productive farm ground, communities, as well as wetland areas. We're a little bit unique in that fact with when it comes to irrigation companies. Some of the things that we're known for and has been part of my, stewardship at Bear River Canal Company is we have a really forward-thinking and progressive improvement system we've been putting in place, both piping miles and miles and miles of canal, as well as installing a state-of-the-art automation system. To date, we're saving over 20,000 acre-feet per year because we're able to do things smarter, not harder, with our automation system. And then our liners are also above that number in the savings that we're seeing. And we've got about a third of our system replaced at this point, and really moving along. And so that's kind of what we're known for, as being progressive and trying to do more with less.
My name is Deborah Van Noy. I'm with Utah Agricultural Land Trust. We work with ag landowners to protect their land from development through the use of conservation easements. One of our board members is a rancher and farmer in Sevier County, and he has educated us on irrigation. And we have come to believe that surface irrigation really has a role and a place in restoring the Great Salt Lake through the groundwater recharge. It's not a popular opinion, but it's something that we've spent a lot of time researching, in discussion with people, and we're learning a great deal, and there is some great research out there to help support this. It turns out that irrigation efficiency can lead to an unexpected outcome, and that is more water being consumed, because it can lead to more, it gives the opportunity for the farmer to have additional cuttings of their alfalfa. That's an example I'll use. And the belief might be that flood irrigation, surface irrigation, is wasteful. It's a loss because of seepage into the groundwater, into the soil. But that seepage goes into the groundwater and has a very beneficial effect to the surrounding areas, the rivers, the tributaries, and in Utah, ultimately to the Great Salt Lake. It has been an approach to irrigation that's been used for many, many years, since the settlers came to Utah. And prior to the mid-'80s, the Great Salt Lake functioned pretty normally and was in a healthy state. But as we've seen development, as we've seen shifts in other approaches to irrigation in agriculture, and as we've seen agriculture decline in Utah, there might be a direct relationship between the decline of the Great Salt Lake. So we're getting involved in this issue, in addition to working with our farmers and ranchers to save their land, and we are doing what we can to get the word out about the value of surface irrigation. I was intrigued by what Darren Parry said, that efficiency does not always guarantee restoration. And we might be seeing efficiency in irrigation, but we're also seeing drier soil, and we're seeing less water get to the Great Salt Lake, and rivers and tributaries drying up.
Thank you. I appreciate those introductions. So when we think about the topic of this panel, agriculture, conservation, water for the lake, that's a huge intersection of a lot of what we all do in our day-to-day lives. And so, Trevor, I'm going to start with you, and I'm going to ask you to set the scene for us. Set the scene of what an agricultural operation looks like today, the pressures that farmers are facing with commodity prices, development, and how do we keep our farmers farming while we're also addressing Great Salt Lake issues?
So, Great Salt Lake efforts really gained legs within the last 7 to 10 years. And in that time period, at the beginning, agriculture was doing quite well. Commodity prices were high. Yields have been up. I mean, it was a good time to be in agriculture. But because of a lot of geopolitical things that are happening, the last 2 years have been quite hard for farmers. They're getting to the point where, in some instances, they are operating below cost, so they're in the red. Now, it's a little bit of a, what's the right word? Catch-22, that this year, with such a severe drought, production's going to be down, and thus we're already seeing prices start to creep up. And so you hate to benefit from others' losses, but irrigated agriculture is probably going to do a little bit better this year. But part of the issue is that where it is so stretched and costs have really somewhat gotten out of control for agricultural inputs, it's a little different scenario than when we started engaging with the people around the lake and addressing lake issues, increasing our efficiencies. We are going to need more resources in order to keep the pace that we've been going at because our producers can't bring the match dollars that they had at one point because they're in a bit of survival mode. As far as our individual producers go, you know, the family farm is something that is struggling to survive. The reason for that is the technology treadmill. You have to innovate, you have to adopt the new things, and they're all very, very expensive. And to run these larger and larger and larger machines, it takes more and more acres. And so what started out 50 years ago is, or maybe even 75 years ago, as a family operation, you know, now they have to be not only a farmer, but a water specialist, a lawyer, a HR specialist, sometimes people's therapist, a mediator, a crop consultant, a commodity specialist. You know, there's all these hats that they have to wear, and Great Salt Lake is yet another hat or another thing that they have to kind of keep in the back of their minds in order to stay viable. And so it's becoming more and more challenging. Now, they are some of the most resilient and hardest working people I know, but you know, I want to just kind of put down that it's a difficult industry to be in right now, and it's a difficult industry to ask more of if you don't bring more resources to the table for them.
Thank you, Trevor. I appreciate that. Okay, Nathan, we've set the scene that farming is difficult, and it's an industry that is constantly changing. So when we think about farming in the Great Salt Lake, where do you see the interests of the Great Salt Lake align with our farmers? And then where do you see that they differ? If we can point some of those things out.
Yeah, great question. So I really appreciate Trevor for setting the stage, because I think that that's one area where there is an alignment, and that is that we now have more interest in working with farmers to do these types of deals to help the lake. And as Deborah said, most of us who do these transactions and actually get water into the lake, what we all realize is that the farms are part of the ecosystem. If the farms go away, we're damaging the ecosystem, we're taking away habitat, we are affecting the water system and how it feeds, particularly the wetlands that are around the lake. So one of the commonalities is that most of the groups that are working on helping to get water to the lake, the trust, the commissioner's office, we don't want to do buy and dry. We want the farmers to maintain their farms because they're part of the system. Now, we want to work with them to help do things so we can get water to the lake, but we don't want them to go away. And part of that deals with what Trevor's saying, is that it's harder and harder to become a farmer every day. So one of the commonalities that we have is we have money. We need a whole lot more money to keep doing the work that we're doing because of the issues that Trevor's saying. It's getting harder and harder for them, but that's one of the incentives that farmers have now is, hey, it's hard for me to be a farmer. I need money for these on-farm improvements. I need money for this technology. I need money to hire all these people. And that's something that we can now do under Utah law that we couldn't maybe 7 years ago, and that is to provide a hard crop of cash to help do some of these things, help them maintain some parts of their farm. Now, the other thing that I would say that there is a commonality is that farmers care as much about the land and the water as probably everybody in this room. And we may express that care and that sentiment differently, but particularly the family farmers, it's part of their culture, it's part of their heritage, it's part of their identity. And one of the concerns that I have when I hear Trevor talk about how hard it is for family farmers to go away, those farmers know that land and that water better than everybody else. And every farm that we have in the water system right now has the potential to be a reservoir that we could do a deal with to help the Great Salt Lake or ecosystems elsewhere in the system. Once that farm's gone, once that family farmer is gone, that knowledge is gone, that expertise is gone, that water resource tool is gone. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't prevent farmers from selling their farms. It's their private property. It's their right. But as a matter of policy, I get very worried when I see people say we just need to get rid of the farms because it's going to hurt the economy, it's going to hurt the ecology, and it's going to make it harder for us to do deals that ultimately help the lake. Now, where I think we differ, now when I work for a lot of my farmers, you know, there's a wide spectrum of farmers. There are farmers who are all for doing leases for the Great Salt Lake, and then there are others that are very afraid. And the ones that are afraid, I totally understand, because as Trevor said, being a farmer is much more of a piece of someone's identity than it is a job, because no one in their right mind would do it to make the money, because you don't make the money. and it's a marginal thing. Most of us don't have jobs that depend on the weather and what it may do, and so they're very frightened. And it's a hard job, and as Trevor said, like the average farmer has to be everything, and they have to be a jack of all trades, and so they see all of this interest in the Great Salt Lake. They may care about the Great Salt Lake, but the concern that I hear them saying is, all right, I get it, Nathan, you've explained the laws, I understand it's temporary, and I'm going to get it back. But once we start putting my water to the lake, I'm just this little guy. I'm not powerful enough to stand up to these forces, and I'm just scared that I'm going to get run over because I don't have the ability to stay on top of things. And I think that's part of where the resources really come to bear. We need more. Whatever we're doing now, I always say, I wish we could fund our water agencies the same way we fund UDOT. No one bats an eye when we pay hundreds of $millions for a freeway interchange because everyone understands why that interchange is needed. We drive on the roads, we see the traffic. We don't understand the role that our farms play in supporting the Great Salt Lake, and we also don't understand just the role water and infrastructure plays generally.
Wonderful. I appreciate that. So fantastic. All right, Adam, I'm going to bounce to you next. So the Trust has done a tremendous amount of work. This really is, when we've started out, a trust building game. It's a very fantastic name, Watershed Enhancement Trust. So when we do have the opportunity to lease agricultural water, we hear regularly from our producers how important it is. They want to know where the water is going. Show me what weir it ran over. Show me what gauge it ran past. Can you talk to us about the work that the Trust has done regarding this effort to verify with our producers this valuable resource is getting where we want it to go?
Yeah, like you said, we hear that all the time when we contemplate leases with people. It's a sacrifice, really. Even though it's compensated, there's money involved. It's a change in the operation, and it becomes like what Trevor said. It's them putting on a different hat or a different role and trying to consider this lease that we're working on with them and trying to figure out how that works with them. So it's a sacrifice of time and effort. And when they undertake that, I think they want to understand that the sacrifice is for a good reason. So I'm proud of the work that the Trust has done since its began to really measure and monitor the delivery of the water that's transacted as it gets to the lake. And it started with the transactions we had in the Jordan River with Marcel Shoup and Max Malmquist when this whole thing started. They were very, very good at working with the river commissioners to be able to show the water actually getting to where it needs to go. And as we started working in the Weber River, which is a little different from the Jordan, we started peeling back some of these bottlenecks or gauging, lack of gauging infrastructure out there that we need to be able to show that water that we lease is going to get to where we need to go. We've done a lot of work with the water conservancy districts and using the infrastructures that they have. For example, our recent transaction with the Huntsville Abbey, water is all the way up in Huntsville, and there's a massive reservoir in between the river and the lake. So how do you get that water there? Well, luckily we had good relationships with the Weber Basin Water Conservancy District to trade water around and be able to actually measure wet water going into Willard Spur at the right time of year. And that's another thing that we've been working on is showing water getting to the right place at the right time. Another thing we've heard on the delivery side is, well, if I lease my water, it's just going to go down the river and go run into a wall of frag at the end, which I totally understand. So we've been working on timing of delivery and are there creative solutions you can come up with to put water in the right place at the right time where it's going to do provide the most ecological benefit. And we hope that starts building that small T trust that we need with more and more producers. And as hopefully if more money's coming online and the preservation fund that's going to be coming through the Great Salt Lake Commissioner's Office, if we can show that it's both monetarily beneficial or at least will compensate you, and there's the ecological benefit, hopefully we're going to engage more and more people. And then the only last thing I would say on the Bear River, where our wetland grant program, we worked with the Fish and Wildlife Service to install more and more gauging at the bottom of the Bear, because we all know that the Bear is the biggest tributary to the lake, but the gauging at the bottom of it becomes really convoluted. Trevor's got incredible gauging on his system, but once it gets back into the river, it's hard to tell exactly where it's going through all those wetland complexes. So we worked really hard with Fish and Wildlife to get more monitoring there, so we'll be able to show transactions going where they need to go.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Okay, Deborah, I'd like to kind of circle back to the comments that you made in the beginning in your introduction. So when we talk about ag optimization and improving irrigation systems, often the example that we point to is converting from flood irrigation to pivot irrigation. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. I'm a shareholder in Bear River Canal Company. I flood irrigate. And so could you just talk to us a little bit more about the value of flood irrigation to the lake and why maybe we need to be a little more strategic about projects that we're implementing to not maybe have these unintended consequences?
Well, let me just start with some examples of one we're looking real closely at now with the Stratos Data Center project that has been introduced. I know that, and you're well aware, that many of the farmers at the north point of the Great Salt Lake do flood irrigate, and their water goes into the Great Salt Lake through the groundwater recharge. How many of them are selling? Should this development go through? I'm reading that 12 to 14 landowners are in negotiation to sell. What kind of impact will that have on water going to the Great Salt Lake from agriculture? So that's a concern. In Sevier County, we know that flood irrigation had been a very common approach to agriculture irrigation, but there has been a switch over to more efficient sprinkler irrigation. And one farmer mentioned to me that the wildlife is struggling to find water because the rivers and streams and tributaries in the public areas are dry. So they're finding their way onto farms and ranches in the area to find water. So it's impacting wildlife habitat as well. I don't know if that directly answered your question, but yeah.
That's wonderful. I loved the comment about the wildlife component. And Trevor, you'll appreciate this also, that we know where the water is in our field from where the ibis are at, right? Like when it's running down the field, we can see how far down the field it's gone from where those ibis are at.
Yeah, they were doing a documentary a couple years ago, and they wanted to get some pictures of some of the birds. And they had been unable to get them in the traditional wetland areas, and they'd come out to see my automation system, and we were driving through, and the filmmaker said, "Stop, stop, stop." And we looked over there, and I said, "Well, yeah, throw your drone out there. I know that guy. He'd be just fine with that." And there were all these birds feeding on the grubs as it was watering, and they flew over the field, and all the birds came up, and you just got these beautiful shots for the documentary. And it really is a food source. And I do want to echo what Deborah has said, that with conservation, there's always a component of return flow that is eliminated with any form of conservation that you do. But what you need to make sure of is that what you're doing, you need to be taking 3 steps forward and only 1 step back. Because there's always going to be some loss of return flow, but you got to make sure that you're making some forward momentum. You're making smart decisions. Because as she's mentioned, there are some things that can increase depletions, or are not really helping the larger problem. And these new forms of flood irrigation are, I think, really a good step in the right direction. I was headed up to one of our canals this morning, and as I was driving along the street there, I saw a whole trailer of those new automated alfalfa riser valves. There's probably 60 of them on this trailer, $3,000 a piece, going out to be deployed to the field. And so farmers are making those investments, and I thought that is so good to see things moving in the right direction.
Wonderful. Thank you. All right, Adam, I'm going to bounce back to you. So when we look at leasing water again, it was shocking to me. I'll just share a funny little story, maybe. So several years ago, I ran the agricultural water optimization program for the Utah Department of Ag and Food, and we had some conversations about new legislation that was passed that allowed us to have saved water. So an ag optimization project could have saved water, kind of a new class of water. And we talked about over and over how fantastic this would be, that we could have saved water and a water right holder could then segment off their saved water and then be able to put it to another beneficial use. And in the middle of a meeting, I just said, well, what about our irrigation companies? And it was just this huge, it feels like this loop that we missed, that 75, 80% of all of agricultural water rights are held within irrigation companies. And it was a step in the process that we missed, that maybe individual producers don't get a specific say in the water. It's companies in general. And so when we look at leasing water, will you talk to us about your role with working with irrigation companies? What does that look like? And how has the trust been able to find win-win solutions for shareholders and then companies together?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah, I think you quote like 80% of our ag water is held in companies. So you might have a shareholder who comes and says, man, I really want to lease my water to the lake. I'm interested in this, and it's going to work with my operation. Like, well, great. Have you told the company that? Well, no. That's a problem. So even though you're a shareholder, and Trevor, you could speak to this better than I can, but the shareholders have right to that share of water, but ultimately it's the company who own the water rights. So if you're talking about changing the use of your water, even if it's just temporary from on that field out to Great Salt Lake, the company has to be involved and made aware of. If for nothing else, that they're the ones managing the water and where it's going in that system. So if you want to deliver that water to the lake, you're going to need to open the valve in the right place to get it where it needs to go. And your ditch riders need to be aware of that so that it goes where you want it to go. So yeah, when the trust is trying to lease with shareholders, it involves meeting with the companies, and I think we do see some nexus of interest with the trust or the commissioner's office and the companies. For example, I think one company that we're working with, they're trying to do their own infrastructure upgrades, and that's costly. And there are some programs out there like water optimization that might work. Or the Board of Water Resources might have some money, but the trust can be a third option or another option for funding sources to help companies upgrade their oftentimes aging infrastructure that was put in 50, 60 years ago and needs to be grown. So we're looking at that as we work with companies to say, we can be a funding source for you as if you work with us on moving some water, whatever amount of water it is, out to Great Salt Lake. And oftentimes with companies that are close to the lake, hopefully the burden isn't too bad because on the delivery side, because their systems are so close that we can measure and monitor that water leaving their system and getting to the lake in a pretty quick fashion.
Thanks. Nathan, anything you'd like to add with the irrigation companies you work with? And then Trevor, I'm going to bounce that back to you also.
Sure. Well, I do have an irrigation company that I just signed a lease with the Commissioner's Office, not the Great Salt Lake Trust. I'd have a conflict of interest in that sense. But their focus was, it was a way to get some extra money to help just fund things, right? It's not easy to be an irrigation company. One thing that Trevor didn't mention is the increase in liability that companies have. As all of these companies urbanize, you have these ditches that used to be out in the middle of nowhere. But now, as everything encroaches, those ditches become an attractive nuisance, and a lot of companies have a hard time maintaining insurance. So that's another cost. So this was the way they did this deal. It was, we're going to lease a little bit of water in the beginning of the season. We'll lease a little bit at the end. And so for a marginal year like this, where they're probably not going to have a whole lot of water or a lot of crop at the end of the year anyway, it made a lot of sense. But one thing I want to add, doing the deals with Adam and the trust with some of the irrigation companies, a lot of the initial deals that we had some large shareholders that had big chunks of water. And we did what are called shareholder change applications. Those are change applications that were just specific to that company's or that shareholder's shares. Now that we've done those, we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit out of the way. And what we're working on now, and there was some legislation this session to help this, is to come up with ways to do a bunch of smaller transactions. And so what we've been doing is doing what we're calling global change applications, where a company will file a change application on its entire right. It'll add the Great Salt Lake as a place of use. And then once that happens, then we don't have to do a change application every time a shareholder comes. Because the transaction costs for Adam and me to do, say, the Bill White monastery transaction, which was, 600 some acre feet, would be the same transaction cost for us to do 5 acre feet. And so it adds up. So getting that change application approved and then being able to aggregate a bunch of smaller shareholders together, I think is the next step that we're working on. Now, those irrigation companies are willing to do those types of changes, are usually bigger, more sophisticated, have resources and attorneys. And so I think the challenge is going to be when we start moving to some of the smaller ones that are interested but don't have all those resources. Like Trevor's probably has one of the most sophisticated irrigation companies, if not the most in the state, in terms of resources, in terms of know-how to do these things. And so we've worked with Trevor a lot on different things, and he's been a great partner. But where I think we're really going to need to get to eventually is these smaller irrigation companies where, you know, you've got the person with the box who's managed the company for 30 years out of their kitchen, and they're the people that I think are going to need some of these more resources to understand things.
Part of the reason why water has been so inexpensive in Utah is because we're able to hold a lot of variables constant. Any of you that work in science know that really you try to hold all variables constant except for the one item that you're looking at. And the problem with leases is that you're asking us to not hold all those variables constant. You're asking us to do something different. So like in my system, we schedule water down to the minute, and they have so much time per week. But then you bring in an idea like a split season lease, and my water's scheduled every week, and they pass from farmer to farmer on individual head gates. So if the farmer in the very middle of the schedule decides to do a split season lease, you're seeing the problem that on the shoulders of the season, there's a hole in the schedule, and then in the middle of the season, he's there. And so how do you manage that out in the field when sometimes the farm is 5 miles from the canal? You can't just shut the water off for 10 minutes or for 2 hours and then turn it back on and expect the water to be there. The system has to charge up. And so there's some of these moving pieces that make it more difficult. Another thing is water rights in general have been administered so well because we hold a lot of variables constant. So when you go to and you shake that up, you stress a lot of people out, particularly like reservoir holders. It just takes some time. I mean, at River Canal Company, we've had some really good experiences with leasing, and we've had some really, some ones that haven't worked out. And I will tell you, we're batting lower than 500. And so we're pushing through the hedge, but they're complicated, as he said.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Deborah, I'd like to ask you kind of a final thought question from you. With your organization, and when we talk about ag optimization and conservation easements and things like that, what kind of policies do you see in that realm that would help facilitate better transactions or be able to tie conservation easements and ag optimization and securing water for the lake, kind of tie these three subjects together?
One idea would be to consider surface irrigation with the funding that's going out there for irrigation efficiency. And I don't know exactly what that might look like, but it might look like, headgate improvements, canal improvements, the things that are part of the flood irrigation component. Very little is applied to that in part of the $200 million UDAF funding for agriculture efficiency. So we would like to see a little bit more attention given to the flood irrigation, bearing in mind its value to the environment. That would go a long way.
Maybe identifying those critical areas where flood irrigation has happened. Right. And maintain those. I love it. Okay, this is going to be the last round robin question for all of you to think about, and then we'll open it up for questions for a minute. So when we talk about farmers and their bandwidth, I appreciated Trevor's conversation about all of the hats that we wear. So I think often it's something that I ask myself a lot is like, how can we ask more of our farmers with all the pressures that they are facing today? And so if you could highlight one thing. So my question is, if you could highlight one thing from your perspective that is critical to making leasing work, what would you say is that critical component? And Deborah, could we start with you? And then we'll just work down the line on what would you say is critical to making agricultural water leasing work for the Great Salt Lake from your perspective?
including surface irrigation as a component to it. I'm not exactly sure how that's done, but in today's world, through the leasing program, water that's irrigated, and then the losses are considered losses to the proponents of the leasing program. This is water that is seeped down in, goes into the groundwater, and it truly isn't loss. In fact, it goes into the environment and back to the Great Salt Lake. So I can't exactly tell you how that would look, but there is a great deal of research being done on this area right now. I wish we could work cooperatively in bringing the surface irrigation component into the efforts to manage the leasing programs. And I wish the policymakers had a more open point of view on our historically used flood irrigation in Utah, because everything kind of stops at the door of drip and sprinkler irrigation as far as creating efficiencies for Utah's water use. So,
Thank you. All right, Trevor, what's critical from your perspective to making leasing work? What do we need to, what nail do we have to hit right on the head?
I think irrigation companies typically have the ability to get back to the waters of the state somehow. So for them, it's about putting in just maybe a singular measurement device. And so I think the biggest thing would be getting the water from the point of return to the Great Salt Lake. If the state could take that off of Canal Company's table so that there was just an answer to push that through, that would really help us, at least up in the Bear.
It's hard to pinpoint one thing, but I think I probably know what you'll say. So yeah. So in lieu of that, I will say capacity for understanding these new tools that are at our disposal, like the dedicated water tool that just came out this year. I think capacity for some of these smaller companies who are, like Nathan said, like it's not their day-to-day, and this is how they've done things for a long time. I think providing tools, resources, or capacity for these companies to understand exactly what's happening and eliminate some of that fear of entering into some of these agreements would probably be helpful.
I've spoken here before, and I will say what I said then, and it's money. But it's not just money, it's a firm source of money. So when we created the trust, the idea was we're going to do a $40 million test project basically to see if this works. I think we've proven that it works. The Commissioner's Office has proven that it works. And so now the next question is, how do we fund all of these things? Because everything everyone talked about here requires money. Money for capacity, money to do the distribution. And to Trevor's point, this is another place where money comes in. I don't think we're funding our water agencies at the levels they need to be. And I don't think we're paying our water staff at the state enough either. And it's hard for that agency to maintain people. Those of us who work in this, you know, most of those people in that agency don't get poached by private industry. They get poached by other local governments. The state is not even competitive with other districts, counties, and cities. And so funding our state regulators and the other folks that do this work is important. But I think the biggest challenge, in my opinion, is the fact that I do think our legislature wants to appropriate more money. But the challenge is every time they try to raise taxes or do anything, their constituents come and yell at them about that. And so what we need to do, I think, all of us who care about this, is to go to our legislature and say, we care about this. We're willing to pay more money so we don't have to pay a whole lot more later. Please fund these important things appropriately. And in my dream world, we would fund our water approaches here in the same way that we fund UDOT. UDOT doesn't have to go out and get private contributions to build an interchange, and no one has a problem with that. And I'm not faulting any, everybody who donates money, please donate money to the trust. We have deals that we're waiting to do. We have stuff, if you give us money, we will get the lake in tomorrow. It's all approved. But that said, we need to, in order to do these deals, because they take so long, all the low-hanging fruit's largely been picked, the Commissioner's Office, the trust, and everybody else who works here, we need to have a stable source of funding, just like UDOT does for the roads that it builds.
Wonderful, thank you. Any final thoughts from any of our panelists, and then we'll open it up for questions? Final thoughts? All right, the time's yours. We can give you your microphone back also.
Yeah, I think this question's for Adam. You talked about working with the reservoirs to try and pass water through and get it to the lake. It seems to me the best time to pass water to the lake is in the winter when there's no straws sucking out of the river. Is there ways to get early releases in February, March before the straws start sucking in return for holding more back in the reservoir later?
Is this working? Okay. Yeah, I think when we do deliver in the winter with some of our water, I would also stress that sometimes it's important to get water in late summer to certain habitats to avoid botulism. So I think keeping all delivery options on the table. I think one of the hardest thing is if you're doing a transaction, and depending on the water right, you might have to deliver at the same CFS rate throughout the whole irrigation season because there might not be any other option. I think you do it if you have to, but the better options are what we talk about. If you can have those creative arrangements with water managers or water districts to store it. But sometimes there's a problem, right? Like it might not be legal to store that water in a federal facility depending on how the water right is constructed. So there's tons of caveats for each water right that we transact that we try to understand as best we can and achieve the best delivery option that you can, whether it's through trades or different arrangements or just transacting that water right straight up and delivering it throughout the irrigation season to the lake. So yeah, to answer your question, yeah, I think all delivery options would be great. Understanding that a lot of the water that we deliver has that key habitat component and to those fringe wetlands that need it at certain times of the year.
Yeah, I think I'm jumping in with you, Adam, and that I think that it's important for this group to understand, and many of you probably already do, but most water rights have a start date and an end date for agricultural use, right? Like you can't use the water until May 1st, and then it's shut off October 31st, and so sometimes being able to have that flexibility, like Adam mentioned, legally is not possible.
Question for whoever gets excited about it. Farming is really hard, and the past few years we're running up against one of the many constraints that nature throws at us. I imagine that in the next 20, 30, however many years, nature will become a lot more predictable as we get better at making guesses about things, but it's never going to become as consistent as contracts would like it to be. I'm interested in your big, crazy ideas. What would your wish be for making a flexible economic environment, technological environment for farmers to be able to adapt dramatically across drought cycles that we can't prevent and can barely mitigate, but have to respond to? What can we do to make it possible to live in the world as it actually is, rather than as we really want to pretend it is?
I love crazy ideas, so I have one. So this is something that those of us who have worked in this field, and I see Warren Peterson here, Warren and I have had this discussion, is what I'd like to see, and I think some of this is in the works, is to come up with kind of a series of option contracts. Or we did water banking. That's, I think, when Trevor, you and I first started working together on that. But the idea is that we have, let's just say, a series of agreements with some agricultural companies or irrigation companies or farmers that have certain metrics that are, hey, when the lake hits this level or the stream hits this level, you guys will do X, Y, and Z, fallow, split season lease, or whatever, and then the water will go to the lake. And that those agreements are already triggered. And then there's a compensation piece to that, of course, so that the farmers then know, okay, if drought happens, I've got X amount of money I can plan on. The lake interests know, okay, when we hit these levels, we have a way to send water there. We have the tools in place now, I think, to do this. We have more tools than we've ever had. It's just they're all new, and that sort of thing takes time, and it also takes money. And so that's something I know I've talked about. There's something called the Colorado Super Ditch in Colorado. They had a similar situation where not the lake, but they had a lot of buy and dry in a place called Cali County, they went from like 55,000 acres of irrigated farmland to like 1,500. And as a result of that, a bunch of irrigation companies banded together and they said, hey, we're going to do some sort of a deal in which we'll provide a hard supply of water for this urban growth, but it's not going to be the same farms, it's not going to be the same water rights, it's going to rotate. So I've always thought I'd like to have a concept like that here with some of our irrigation companies, so they have an idea of what they're doing, they have an idea that they can get some money when the drought hits, and then we have an ability to send water down. And I think that's possible now, it's just going to take some time.
I want to ruminate on this a little more. You go ahead.
Okay. I don't know, but what about asking those farmers who are irrigating efficiently to forego that fourth and fifth crop? That's a tough one. But maybe that's providing more water to the lake by reduced usage. There's also talk of perhaps thinking about transferring some of the cropland to rangeland in certain areas. Now, I don't know how quickly you can make that transition, but that might be something that could be considered. So those are a couple of ideas.
I was just going to say, to the money component of this, I've been very successful at getting grants while being the manager at Bear River Canal Company, but I can't tell you how many, and I don't mean to be punny, how many pipe dreams I've sent off to different government agencies of, yeah, we could do this, this, and this, and then I don't get any sort of funding in response to those requests. And so, it needs to be less like pulling the lever on the slot machine, and it needs to be more of a mechanism that when you have a good idea, you can get it funded and keep those things moving. And so, another plug for additional funding, we could make things happen faster.
I'll just add the dedicated water tool that just came out this year is one of those kind of flexible arrangements to, we're going to have an idea of what the water year is by March or something. And if you have a dedicated water application could be indefinite, and it says every year you're going to decide how much water is going to be delivered as part of whatever transaction you've done. So hopefully, like Nathan said, we have some of the tools in place to do some of these crazy ideas.
I'll just echo Adam. I love that the dedicated water, our producers make decisions based on the weather, and dedicated water will allow them to do that also. So I'm really excited about that. I think that's a fantastic tool that we can implement.
Thanks all.
I'm not a worn-out old Indian, but I'm a worn-out old man. In 1993, we put our sailboat at the Great Salt Lake Marina, the South Marina, and we were fine there. And about 2022, when the lake kind of bottomed out, as they say, we had to take all the boats out of the marina. The marina became high and dry. You couldn't use it. And we just received notice that this June, middle of June, we will have to pull all the boats out of the lake again. Now, when I look at the numbers that are proposed to be saved, I see numbers like getting more water to the lake. It's about 170,000 acre feet per year. That's the number I see. Yet the number I hear kicked around is that we need 800,000 acre feet per year. We've done a lot, and we're doing a lot. My question, I guess, to the panel is, are we doing enough?
So I think one thing we've talked about largely is leasing. And leasing is one part of this larger toolbox that we're going to have to use as a state. The state just recently did the U.S. MAG purchase, which is going to put some water in there. But I want to be clear that leasing is not the silver bullet. We're not going to save the Great Salt Lake through leasing alone. And the analogy I would use is, anybody ever seen the movie Moneyball? It's one of my favorite baseball movies, but the whole point about it is about the Oakland A's when they weren't very rich, didn't have a lot of money, and so what they did was instead of focusing on high-profile players that would hit home runs, they just focused on getting players who would get on base, whether they got hit by pitches more than others or they got walked. And that's the approach that I think we're trying to take with water leasing, is let's just get as many of these and aggregate them over time. But there are going to need to be other things that are done. I know the commissioner's office is working on those. That's why they were created. Leasing is part of that. But the point is yeah, are we where we need to be right now? No. And I think we can get to be where we need to be, but we're not going to be able to do it at the current funding levels. We're going to need to change that mindset. I think as taxpayers, we're all going to need to be willing to pay more for this type of stuff. And we're going to need to give our political leaders the ability to appropriate that money for that to happen.
Yeah, Emily Lewis likes to say we need to eat elephants really quickly. So yeah, I think the past couple of years have been drastic change in terms of our tools and assets in terms of getting water to the lake, and we're just in this nascent period of implementing those tools. And yeah, are we where we need to be right now? No, but we need, hopefully with more resources, we're going to get there.
Again, I'd echo the funding problem. The speed at which we can deploy is really constrained by that, as well as just the fact that, it took tens of years to build these massive agricultural systems, and it's going to take tens of years to bring them up into, these levels where they are doing more with less. And so, even as progressive as Bear River Canal Company is, I had a canal breach last week, and those type of things just happen because of aged out infrastructure. And so we've got to increase the pace. We've got to have more funding, and then we've got to be reasonable about how fast you can change such large, hard infrastructure.
Hi there. I'm curious about the future of farming and farmers, and if you think the next generation of people coming up want to inherit their family farm, if they want to be farmers, and if there's opportunities for land and water conservation that exist possibly in the future that we don't know about now.
I'll speak to that. I'm in Cache Valley, and our ag landowners are generational farmers, 4th and 5th generation, and most of them have sons and daughters that want to continue in farming. There's also, I see urban young adults interested in being outdoors and exploring agriculture. And I also see something interesting happening at the national level, and that is this emphasis now on fresh, local food, fruits, vegetables, dairy. This push is having an impact nationally. There are places across the country that they're doing remarkable things with, farm to table, small communities, innovating with bringing the local fare to the community. I know that if Chandler's in the room, she's a real advocate for this, and she had a terrific symposium a couple of weeks ago. Utah really needs to step it up in this area because a lot is happening, particularly back east in upstate New York, as I mentioned, in some of the southern states of the country. They're doing some really great things, and the public is attracted to it. You see that here in our farmers markets in Salt Lake City. They're packed. We just need to take that further and keep encouraging local production of our foods and our. I don't know if you know this statistic, but 50 years ago, Utah could feed the population of the state, and today we produce 2% of our vegetables. That means 98% are imported, and 3% of our fruits. That means 97% are imported. We provide 25% of our dairy, so much of it is imported. Those numbers really need to be reversed if we're going to have a viable agricultural community, and we hope that we can make it happen.
I would also just add, I think if there's something good that came out of COVID, that it brought the focus of that local food supply need back to the forefront of our minds, and we've seen that resurgence happening, which I think is a good thing.
Can I add one more thing? When land is put into a conservation easement, the value of that ag land is reduced significantly. When that ag land is reduced in value, the opportunity presents for a young person, a young family, to think about buying 10, 20, 50 acres of land. At its market price, it's out of their reach. But once it is given a conservation value, it goes down in value a great deal, and that's where the opportunity lies.
Thank you for the panel. This has been really interesting. I have a question relating to Debbie's comment about the flood irrigation. It's my understanding that some other states give some credits to farmers for recharge. So that could be from unlined ditches or canals, or even when rivers are nearing flood stage to take some water in the winter. California has done that. So outside of irrigation season, they've changed the rules so farmers could take some water to kind of take the peak off of floods and recharge aquifers. So I guess what are your thoughts on that? Could some of those sorts of ideas count or be adapted for Utah, where maybe those, that recharge, a proportion of it counts against your diversions, or you get some other sort of credit for that recharge?
In California in 2023, in the Sacramento area, farmers were asked to flood irrigate. They needed to find a place for the water, recognizing too that the aquifers were in dire need of the water. So they have done some innovative things there, and I need to investigate those other states and the recharge credits. Sure, we could do more in that area. Let's hope we get moisture and rain to be in that favorable predicament. That's the challenge that I see and am concerned about.
Thank you. I wanted to ask Trevor, it seems like you probably have hundreds of shareholders, or there's a lot of shareholders of 68,000 acres are being irrigated by the Bear River Canal Company. And that's a patchwork quilt. You gave the example of if you have somebody in the ditch that's taking a water turn and he wants to do a split season lease and you have a gap, and all of that seems complicated to me. I was wondering at the company level if it would be possible, if enough money were involved, for the canal company as an entity which holds the water rights to allow water going to the lake, being paid for it, and then working it out among the shareholders of how that works. And maybe the money goes for enhancements to the system. Maybe some shareholders opt to do a split season or following for that season. They get a cash payment. But instead of having to deal with a myriad of individual shareholders do, like Nathan said, to do these shareholder applications, it's very complicated, and it's hard to do at scale. But with 68,000 acres and maybe some 320,000 acre feet of water, whatever you all manage at 4 acre feet, I mean, it's a big pool, one-stop shop. Is any of that possible?
Yeah, so two thoughts. First of all, most irrigation companies have some sort of bartering or trading system within their canal system. Ours is called our lease pool. And so internally, there's a lot of mechanisms already in place. It's just there's some limitations, like with the split season in my system, that's going to be really difficult to pull the trigger on. So on the shareholder side, that's one thing to consider. Another thing is that canal companies have shares held in common, and how they got those is people didn't pay their assessments, and since we're so old, there's a decent number of shares held in common. And as a result, that's water that, rather than going into a lease pool of some kind, could be taken and used, as you've described, where the trust is working with one entity, the irrigation company, and then those proceeds could either be divvied out to the shareholders or put into the system as our in-kind contribution to these grants and things that we're getting. So to answer your question, there are some opportunities. It's just each system's going to have its own flavor, unfortunately. And that's what he spends most of his time doing, is figuring out what flavor of ice cream he's got.
Thank you.
Hi. First off, just thank you again. But I am obviously young, right? I'm 21. I think that a big part of that is because of education and outreach, right? That's why I'm here. Is I've been educated and I've been outreach too, right? So yeah. But when it comes to like the leasing program, are there any like programs that are currently set up in outreach and education to farmers on earlier there's that mention of the ecosystem, like thinking of your farm as an ecosystem, right, and being part of the larger ecosystem. Is there any kind of like educational stuff that's being put out for that to try and get farmers to change their mindsets to think in that kind of a route?
Yeah, I'll offer a few thoughts. Yeah, I personally try to go to a lot of conservation district meetings, and probably most of you are aware, but conservation districts, there's, I don't know, 50 some odd conservation districts throughout the state, and it's groups of producers who gather to figure out conservation issues in their region. I think mostly it started as soil conservation in the Dust Bowl in the 30s, but has transitioned into water and soil and all other things. So I attend those meetings personally. We also attend other agricultural meetings throughout the state. And then I would say when the commissioner's office hired Hannah, that was a big conduit to a lot of what's going on in the agricultural space to enhance leasing.
I would also add Utah Farm Bureau. Speaking of Utah Farm Bureau, Warren.
Yeah.
What'd you have?
That playbook we've talked about, right? I have two questions. I've already heard Trevor say this isn't going to be cheap. And you know the business proposition that you can have three things. There's cheap, fast, or good. You only get to choose two. We know that cheap isn't the one to choose. Are there any funding probably a question for you, Hannah. Are there any funding sources that we have not tapped that you'd like to see us put some emphasis on? Is that a fair question?
Sure.
All right.
It's a fair question that probably warrants some more thought than I have right here.
No pun intended, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Deborah's going to answer for me.
Heart of the Rockies is one I would think of. In northern Utah, we have an opportunity to be in that in the company of the land trusts that are in Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, and northern Utah, and they're well funded with private money that then they farm out. No pun intended.
We should talk further.
I'll just also add, I mean, I think we have the opportunity to capitalize with some of our other private partners like Great Salt Lake Rising, Great Salt Lake Alliance, so many wonderful stalwart families of our communities that are stepping up to be a part of this problem as well.
Very good. Can I ask you a technical question now?
Yes.
These mutual irrigation companies, and we know so much of what we're doing goes through those companies, needs to, but they're typically a 501c12 under the Internal Revenue Code organization, which limits how much money they can take in for sources other than assessments. Are we doing the research necessary to avoid bumping our canal companies into being something other than nonprofit?
So the key is spend the money. So another place to focus on is
spend
because
it on
there's
infrastructure. Is that?
Well, let me back up. So to his question is where, like the education question was asked earlier,
Yes.
because they're C Corps, they have to have an annual shareholders meeting. And so that's another place where education is very important because they have to have that. And coming in with a clear, concise, this is the price, this is the program, this is how it would work. Hannah did a presentation at our annual meeting, and even though we haven't moved all the roadblocks out of the way that would be required for our shareholders to participate, I saw pencils coming out and phones coming out and calculators running, and they're viewing this as a commodity, which I think is the goal. It's another tool in their toolbox, especially in drought.
We had a speaker yesterday named Hannah that said that, by the way.
To your question on the 501c type 12 corporation, so you can't take the incomes in if they aren't spent, is my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
And so, how do I put this? So if it's spent on infrastructure projects for the match monies that I was discussing, it can pass through pretty quickly because that's an immediate expenditure. You know, the cash is not staying in the account. It's not, it does depreciate out over time, but it's not like you're getting rich off this, right? Mm-hmm. Now, as far as distributing to the shareholders, I do think that's an area that we need some clarification on the tax code, is if I was going to distribute a payment to my shareholders, we are a not-for-profit, but they are for-profit, and so how that works is maybe something that the state could clarify for us, or the Fed.
And you probably don't want to be the guinea pig, do you?
No, I pushed through enough hedges. It's someone else's
turn. But the answer is we need to do some more looking at that. Is that where we are?
Last question, thank you.
Okay. Sorry to keep everyone from their beer, but one final question, and this was a follow-up question for Trevor, and just a clarification. I think it was Trevor that mentioned if you could do one thing that would be really helpful, you talked about where additional gauging could happen that either the canal company would pay versus sort of perhaps the state or a public funding source to chase that water down to the lake. Could you explain that a little bit more?
So I'm going to punt this to Nathan because he's the lawyer in the room, but to tee him up, basically, as a change application applicant, you have the burden to make sure that whatever you're doing happens. And so if you can streamline that, so the only thing I have to do as a canal company is make sure it gets from my ditch back to the river, and then everything else is already in place, then that simplifies the issue for me.
Yeah, and so Hannah's question was, what's the one thing you would do? The second thing I would do is gauging and data. Those right now, I know every time people talk to me like, well, we just need to change the law. I'm like, we did that. That's done. I mean, it's not that it's perfect. We can tweak it and edit, but we are in project implementation phase right now. And what the biggest obstacles are funding, and the second one is your point, is data. And so what Trevor said is right. Now, if I go and file a change application in a river system that doesn't have the necessary data or gauging or metering, I've got to put it there. But part of that is if we get more money to the state agencies or we get money to put those gauges in place, that would help. Now, this comes at a kind of a tricky time for this because some of the most successful gauging programs we've had have been a cooperative undertaking with the federal government and with state contributions. But you know, over years, the federal contribution to these gauging programs have gotten less and less and less, and it's become more and more of a state burden. And this is part of the challenge, is that one of the benefits of living in Utah is this was a very well-managed state from a water perspective. I used to work with all the western states, and Utah was unique in the sense that these towns were put next to mountains. It's a dry state, but they put them next to places where water was relatively cheap and easy to get to. And so we have a system that's built on this cheapness, and we have infrastructure that's cheap, but we have a gauging system that was built on a funding model that no longer exists. And that is a huge obstacle that's going to need to be fixed, and it's going to require money.
I would also add to that that the burden falls solely on the Division of Water Rights. When we ask, did the water make it to the lake, it's a water rights responsibility to say, yes, it did. And anything that we can do to help that be easier for water rights, it ran over this gauge and we can point to it. We need to be able to support water rights in doing that. It's a double benefit to our producers also.
I would say I think water rights is in that phase right now of implementing a lot of gauging, and I would also just shout out the trust for especially a lot of our wetland projects that our partners are working on that we funded. A big component of what they're doing is involving gauging, not just the Bear River example, which is a huge one, but all along Farmington Bay. All of the projects going on there are going to include some aspect of gauging that should hopefully make those deliveries more possible.
All right, thank you all. I appreciate you being here.
Thanks for that great conversation. I learned a lot. Please join us now for refreshments and posters. just over yonder. And if you can't, we'll see you early tomorrow morning. Thank you.